Serpent Valley stretched like an open wound across the Afghan earth. Its steep walls rose to meet a sky bleached white by a merciless sun. A convoy of dust-caked Humvees crawled along the valley floor, the silence of their approach broken only by the crackle of radio checks and engines straining against the incline. Bravo 6, this is Echo 2, visual sweep clear, proceeding to checkpoint Alpha. Then came the sound that veterans hear in their nightmares. The hollow thump of an IED, followed by the metallic screech of shrapnel tearing through armor. The lead Humvee disappeared in a cloud of dust and fire. Ambush! Ambush! Tracer rounds cut through the air like angry fireflies, their red streaks marking paths of certain death. Marines scrambled for cover, their boots kicking up dirt as they dove behind disabled vehicles in shallow depressions in the ground. Return fire erupted, but it was scattered, unfocused, a panicked response against an enemy that seemed to materialize from the ridgelines themselves. "This is Porter. We're pinned down at grid 7904, taking fire from all sides." Blood pooled beneath a young corporal slumped against a wheel well, his eyes wide with the shock that precedes death. 3 Marines dragged a wounded comrade behind a smoking engine block, bullets kicking up dust inches from their heels. Lieutenant Jason Porter pressed his back against the remains of his destroyed Humvee, blood streaming from a gash across his forehead. His driver lay motionless beside him, half his face missing. The gunner screamed somewhere behind him, high-pitched and inhuman, the sound of a man discovering parts of himself no longer attached. "If we don't get air support in the next 5 minutes, we're all going to die here," Porter whispered into his radio, his voice steady despite the chaos. In the sudden, terrible stillness that followed, a single shot echoed across the valley. Then another, and another. Precise, measured, deadly. On the eastern ridge, a Taliban machine gunner collapsed over his weapon. His companion reached for the trigger, then jerked backward as a bullet found his chest. An RPG team poised to fire on Porter's position fell in quick succession, their rocket launcher clattering to the ground, unfired. "What the hell?" Porter breathed, watching through his binoculars as enemy positions went silent one after another. Someone was out there. Someone was saving them. 72 hours earlier, dawn at Firebase Liberty painted the mountains in shades of amber and gold, the beauty a stark contrast to the base's utilitarian ugliness. Concrete barriers, razor wire, and prefabricated buildings arranged with military precision. Heat already shimmered above the landing strip where a Chinook thundered to life, preparing for another mission into contested territory. Inside a small maintenance building converted to an armory, Staff Sergeant Sophie Reed sat cross-legged on a tarp spread across the floor. Before her lay the disassembled components of an M485 sniper rifle, the Marine Corps' standard-issue precision weapon. Each piece was meticulously arranged, the metal surfaces gleaming with the dull sheen of recent cleaning. Sophie moved with practiced efficiency, her hands steady as she inspected the bolt face for carbon buildup. She ran an oiled cloth down the barrel's rifled interior, checking for imperfections invisible to the untrained eye. The scope, a Schmidt & Bender PM2 525x56 with Horus H58 reticle, received special attention, its glass surfaces clean with the delicacy reserved for religious artifacts. This wasn't standard maintenance. This was ritual. Next to her lay a small green notebook, its pages filled with neat handwriting, columns of numbers, calculations for various distances and wind conditions, and hand-drawn diagrams of bullet trajectories. Where the military taught standardized formulas, Sophie had developed her own, tailored to her shooting style and the specific characteristics of her rifle. "Most people just use the charts," a gravelly voice observed from the doorway. Sophie didn't startle. Few people could sneak up on her, and Colonel William Bill Taylor wasn't among them. At 65, the The retired Marine Master Sergeant moved with the telltale heaviness of aging joints and old wounds. His presence at Firebase Liberty was unusual. Officially, he served as a civilian consultant for marksmanship training. Unofficially, everyone knew he was there to evaluate combat readiness before the planned drawdown. Bill's ice blue eyes had faded with age but lost none of their intensity. His silver hair was still cut high and tight, and a long scar ran from his left temple to his jawline, a souvenir from Desert Storm that he wore like a badge of honor. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over a chest that remained barrel solid despite his years. "Charts are for people who accept average results," Sophie replied, not looking up as she reassembled the rifle with fluid motions. "I don't." Bill's weathered face creased in a smile. "Your daddy taught you that." The mention of her father caused Sophie's hands to pause for just a fraction of a second, a hesitation so brief anyone else would have missed it. But Bill noticed. He noticed everything. "He did," she acknowledged, sliding the bolt assembly back into place with a satisfying click. Thomas Reed had been one of the finest snipers in the Corps, with confirmed kills in both Gulf Wars that rewrote the standards for long-distance shooting. But to Sophie, he'd simply been Dad, the man who taught her to shoot on their small Texas ranch, who emphasized patience and control above all else. "Never rush the shot," he'd tell her, as they lay side by side on a hill overlooking tin cans arranged at various distances. "The bullet doesn't care if you're excited or scared or angry. It follows physics, not feelings." By 10, she could outshoot most adults at the local range. By 16, she'd developed the almost supernatural stillness that separated good shooters from great ones. The ability to control not just her breathing, but her heartbeat, to exist in perfect harmony with the Earth's rotation and the wind's subtle shifts. When Thomas died, a car accident on a rain-slicked highway, when Sophie was 18, he left her his old Winchester and the notebook he'd kept throughout his career. The last entry, written the day before his death, read simply, "The shot you don't take haunts you longer than the ones you do." She joined the Marines a week after his funeral. Bill crossed the room and lowered himself onto a wooden crate, his knees cracking in protest. "Your rifle's already cleaner than the day it was issued. What are you really doing in here, Reed?" Sophie secured the scope mount with practiced precision. "Preparing. For what? You've been relegated to support detail since you arrived." Her expression remained neutral, but something flashed in her eyes, a momentary glimpse of the fire she kept carefully banked. "Things change." Bill leaned forward, lowering his voice though they were alone. "I knew your father in Iraq, Second Battle of Fallujah. He saved my platoon with shots that shouldn't have been possible." He paused, studying her face. "Jack would be proud of what you did yourself 5 years back, even if those pencil pushers at the Pentagon buried the records." Sophie's head snapped up, her composure cracking for the first time. "You know about that?" The old sniper's laugh was dry as desert air. "Girl, I helped design the Phantom program. You think I wouldn't recognize one of our own?" He tapped his index finger against her wrist, exactly where Sophie's uniform sleeve covered a small tattoo. "Phantom 7, if I recall correctly." Sophie instinctively tugged her sleeve lower, concealing the mark that identified her as part of an elite ghost unit. Snipers who operated beyond conventional military structure, executing missions that officially never happened. Missions like the one in Fallujah that had saved 30 Delta Force operators but cost her career in combat operations. "That program doesn't exist," she said carefully, "and I'm just a regular Marine sniper assigned to communication support." "Sure you are." Bill nodded toward the notebook. "That why you're calculating wind vectors for shots beyond 1,500 meters for your communications duties?" She closed the notebook. "Force of habit." Old Bill's eyes softened. "They buried you in paperwork because they couldn't handle what you represent. A woman who can outshoot every swinging dick in this base threatens the natural order." He snorted. "Politics over practicality. Tale as old as time. I follow orders, Sophie said flatly. So did your father, until he didn't. Bill stood with a grunt, joints protesting. You know what Thomas told me once? He said, sometimes saving lives requires breaking rules. Wise man, your daddy. He turned to leave but paused at the doorway. The battalion's moving into Serpent Valley tomorrow. Op briefing at 1800. You might want to attend, even if you're not on the roster. His eyes, suddenly sharp as a hawk's, locked with hers, just in case things change. After he left, Sophie sat motionless, her hand resting on the rifle stock. Then she opened her notebook again, turning to a blank page. At the top, she wrote, Serpent Valley, approach vectors and wind analysis. She had preparations to make. The mess hall at Firebase Liberty resembled a high school cafeteria transplanted to a war zone. Long metal tables, institutional lighting, and social hierarchies as rigid as the Marines' posture. The air hung heavy with the smell of powdered eggs, industrial-strength coffee, and the particular musk of too many bodies confined in too small a space. Sophie moved through the chow line with practiced efficiency, keeping her eyes on her tray and her expression neutral. The server, a bored contractor with sweat stains blooming under his arms, slopped reconstituted eggs next to something that might have been sausage in a previous life. She nodded her thanks and turned to find a seat. The mess hall wasn't full, but it might as well have been. As she walked past tables, conversations quieted, shoulders stiffened, and eyes slid away. Not from fear or respect, but from the particular discomfort Marines felt around those who didn't fit the mold, those whose presence represented an inconvenient challenge to the established order. Look alive, boys. Dead weight incoming, a voice called out, just loud enough to be heard but not quite loud enough to be considered insubordination. Sergeant Alex Murphy sat at a table surrounded by his usual entourage, Marines who'd played college football, who measured worth in bench press numbers and combat deployments. At 35, Murphy carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who'd never doubted his place in the hierarchy. His broad shoulders strained against his uniform, and his face carried the weathered look of someone who'd seen enough combat to be dangerous, but not enough to be humble. Hey, Reed, he called as she passed. Heard you qualified on the range yesterday. What did they have you shoot at? The broadside of a barn? Snickers rippled through his audience. Sophie kept walking, her face a mask of indifference. She found an empty table in the corner and sat with her back to the wall, a habit born of both tactical awareness and social necessity. The quota sniper strikes again, Murphy stage whispered to his companions. Pentagon needs its diversity numbers, even if it means putting a rifle in hands that can barely carry it. More laughter, louder now. Sophie ate methodically, her movements economical, her eyes occasionally scanning the room with the automatic situational awareness of someone who had operated in hostile territory. Not the battlefields of Afghanistan, but the equally treacherous terrain of being a woman in a world designed by and for men who resented her presence. Across the mess hall, another set of eyes watched the exchange. Lieutenant Jason Porter, 26 and only 6 months into his commission, observed with a frown. Unlike the others, Porter had reviewed the service records of everyone under his command, including the mysterious Sergeant Reed, whose file contained more redacted sections than actual information. Next to Porter sat Commander Mark Wilson of SEAL Team 6, a stocky man with the quiet intensity of someone who preferred action to words. At 45, Wilson had the reputation and the scars to command respect without demanding it. He had arrived at Firebase Liberty 2 days earlier for joint operations planning, and his presence added an unusual tension to the base's atmosphere. Your Marines always this welcoming? Wilson asked Porter, nodding toward Murphy's table. Porter shifted uncomfortably. Murphy's a good Marine. Just old school. Old school? Wilson repeated, his tone making it clear what he thought of that assessment. His eyes returned to Sophie, sitting alone. And Sergeant Reed? Porter shrugged. Support detail, communications, intelligence analysis. Keeps to herself. She's a qualified sniper. On paper, Porter replied. Colonel Harrison keeps her on base operations. Says her skills are better utilized in support roles. Does he now? It wasn't a question. Wilson stood, gathering his tray. Instead of heading for the disposal area, he walked directly to Sophie's table and set his tray down across from her. Mind if I join you, Sergeant? Sophie looked up, surprise briefly crossing her features before the professional mask returned. Of course not, sir. Wilson sat, his movements controlled and deliberate. Commander Mark Wilson, SEAL Team 6. I know who you are, sir. The corner of Wilson's mouth twitched. I expect you do. He took a bite of eggs, chewed thoughtfully. Heard there's a range qualification this afternoon. You planning to attend? I've already qualified, sir. Not what I asked. Sophie studied him for a moment, trying to read the intent behind the question. I generally practice daily, sir, when duties permit. Wilson nodded. I'll see you there then. Across the mess hall, Murphy and his group watched the exchange with poorly concealed interest. The SEAL commander's deliberate association with the female sniper sent a clear message, one that would ripple through the base's social structure. Sophie found Bill waiting for her in his makeshift office, a converted storage room filled with ballistics charts and vintage firearms that he'd somehow smuggled into a war zone. He dialed the combination on a small safe in the corner and removed a folder with no markings. The Serpent Valley mission isn't a standard sweep operation, he said without preamble, placing the folder on his desk. It's bait. Bait for what? Sophie asked, remaining standing at parade rest. Not what. Who? Bill's expression darkened. Intelligence suggests a former Russian Spetsnaz operator is training Taliban fighters in advanced ambush tactics. Viktor Sokolov. He opened the folder to reveal satellite imagery of the valley with annotations highlighting potential sniper positions and ambush points. The same one who nearly wiped out Wilson's team in Fallujah before you intervened. They're using this mission to draw him out, Sophie said, understanding dawning. Bill nodded grimly. Harrison knows what he needs to know. To him, this is a standard operation with standard protocols. His eyes hardened. Which is why you've been deliberately excluded from the mission roster. That makes no sense. If they're reactivating me, think, Sophie. What happens when 480 Marines roll into that valley and meet a force trained by one of Russia's best snipers? Understanding dawned on her face. They're expecting casualties. They're counting on them, Bill corrected grimly. Nothing motivates a reactivation like Marines in body bags. Nothing justifies bending rules like a massacre in progress. Sophie closed the folder, her mind racing. Why tell me this? Old Bill's weathered face softened slightly. Because your father was my friend. Because you deserve to know when you're being used as a pawn. He paused. And because 480 young men and women shouldn't die as political chess pieces. What am I supposed to do with this information? That's up to you, Sergeant. Bill turned away, signaling the end of the conversation. Briefings at 1800. I'd recommend attending. Knowledge is only power if you have it before you need it. As Sophie left the office, the weight of the folder in her hands felt heavier than any rifle she'd ever carried. The briefing room hummed with the controlled chaos of pre-mission preparations. Maps covered the walls, and a three-dimensional terrain model of the Serpent Valley dominated the central table. Officers clustered in small groups, reviewing intelligence reports and contingency plans, with the focused intensity of men preparing to lead others into harm's way. Colonel James Harrison stood at the head of the room, his posture ramrod straight, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a career officer. At 52, he'd survived 3 wars, earned 2 Purple Hearts, and developed a 1,000-yard stare that came from writing too many letters to too many families. Intelligence indicates minimal enemy presence in the Eastern Corridor, he explained, using a laser pointer to trace the planned route. 2 platoon will establish a blocking position at the northern entrance, while the main force sweeps from south to north, clearing any resistance. Sophie sat in the back row, absorbing every detail. The official briefing matched what Bill had shared, but with critical omissions. No mention of the Spetsnaz operator, no acknowledgement of the perfect ambush conditions created by the valley's geography. The mission was presented as a routine sweep operation with expected light resistance. She studied the terrain model, noting how the steep walls created natural choke points, the narrow entrance where the convoy would enter, the limited approach vectors that channeled movement into predictable lanes, the elevated positions that provided perfect firing solutions down into the valley floor. It wasn't just a potential ambush site. It was a killing box designed by someone who understood both terrain and human psychology, someone trained to exploit predictable tactical responses. When Harrison opened the floor for questions, Sophie raised her hand. The colonel's eyes swept past her as if she weren't there. She raised it higher. "Colonel," she said, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation, "I have concerns about the terrain analysis." The room quieted, every head turned in her direction. Harrison's expression tightened almost imperceptibly before he nodded. "Go ahead, Sergeant." Sophie stood and approached the terrain model. The valley configuration presents optimal conditions for a prepared ambush. These ridge lines provide interlocking fields of fire covering all approach and exit routes. Her finger traced the contours of the surrounding hills. If enemy forces have occupied these positions with crew-served weapons, our convoy would be caught in a crossfire with limited cover and no viable extraction route. A few officers exchanged glances. Lieutenant Porter leaned forward, studying the model with newfound concern. Commander Wilson, standing in the back corner, watched with undisguised interest. Harrison's voice remained level, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. "Your concern is noted, Sergeant. However, intelligence confirms minimal enemy presence." "Intelligence can be manipulated, sir. The terrain cannot." Sophie pointed to specific features. "These draws provide perfect concealment for RPG teams. These elevated positions would allow machine gun emplacements to cover the entire valley floor. The restricted width prevents vehicles from turning around once engaged." Sergeant Murphy, seated in the front row, turned to face her. "Since when do comms personnel give tactical assessments?" "Reed, stick to radios." Several Marines chuckled, but the laughter died quickly when Wilson spoke from the back. "I've seen similar terrain used to devastating effect in previous operations." The SEAL commander's voice carried the weight of hard-won experience. "Sergeant Reed's assessment merits consideration." Harrison's expression hardened. "The operational plan stands. We have air support on standby and artillery coverage from Firebase Romeo." He looked directly at Sophie for the first time. "Sergeant, while your enthusiasm is noted, tactical assessment is outside your purview. Return to your station." "Sir, that's an order." "Sergeant?" Sophie held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly respectful, then nodded sharply. "Yes, sir." As she returned to her seat, she caught Bill's eye. The veteran sniper gave an almost imperceptible nod. Confirmation that she'd done what she could within the constraints of military protocol. Now the decision was hers. The briefing continued, but Sophie heard little of it. Her mind was already calculating angles, distances, wind patterns, the 1,000 variables that separated successful shots from missed opportunities. In her head, she was no longer in the briefing room, but on a ridge line overlooking the valley, watching through her scope as a scenario unfolded. After the briefing, as Marines filtered out to prepare equipment and write last letters home, a tradition many observe before operations, regardless of the assessed threat level, Lieutenant Porter approached Sophie. "That was a solid terrain assessment, Sergeant," he said quietly. "I've added some additional security measures based on your observations." "Thank you, sir, but it's not enough." Sophie glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "The valley is a natural ambush point. Even with additional security, a well-coordinated attack could inflict severe casualties before effective countermeasures could be deployed." Porter frowned. "You seem very certain." "I am, sir. That terrain speaks to anyone who knows how to listen." The lieutenant studied her face. "I'll keep your concerns in mind, Sergeant." He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I requested you for the operation as a spotter at minimum. Colonel Harrison denied it personally." Sophie wasn't surprised, but the confirmation stung nonetheless. "Be careful tomorrow, Lieutenant. Watch the eastern ridge. That's where I'd put my best shooters if I were setting the ambush." Porter nodded, his youthful face suddenly grave with the responsibility of leading men into potential danger. "I will. Thank you, Sergeant." After he left, Sophie returned to her quarters, a small private room that was one of the few perks of her unusual status on the base. She spread maps across her bed, comparing them with the satellite imagery Bill had provided. Using a protractor and pencil, she marked firing positions, calculated distances, and noted potential wind channels created by the valley's configuration. In her notebook, she recorded precise coordinates, elevation adjustments, and estimated bullet drop for various ranges. It was well past midnight when she finally set her work aside. Tomorrow, 480 Marines would enter the Serpent Valley, following a plan that ignored obvious dangers and discounted clear warning signs. They would be led by officers who trusted intelligence reports over physical evidence and protocol over instinct. And she would be left behind to watch from a distance, because a woman who could outshoot every man on the base threatened the established order. Because acknowledging her skills meant acknowledging that the barriers placed before her were arbitrary rather than necessary, because it was easier to risk lives than to challenge conventions. Sophie lay back on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. She thought of her father's last written words. "The shot you don't take haunts you longer than the ones you do." Tomorrow, Marines would die in a valley that might as well have been designed for their slaughter. The question wasn't whether she could save them. She knew she could. The question was whether she would accept the consequences of defying direct orders to do so. As dawn broke over the mountains, Sophie had her answer. She began preparing her rifle, her movements deliberate and precise. Whatever came next, she would face it without hesitation or regret. The shot not taken was the one that haunted, and Sophia Reed had no intention of living with those particular ghosts. The convoy rolled out at dawn, a column of dust-caked vehicles stretching like vertebrae along the spine of the mountain road. Humvees and MRAPs moved in tight formation, gunners scanning the ridgelines through mounted optics, their faces set in the frozen concentration of men entering hostile territory. Lieutenant Jason Porter rode in the lead vehicle, his helmet low over his eyes, one hand gripping the radio handset, while the other rested near his sidearm. At 26, this was his first major command. 480 Marines under his tactical direction. The responsibility sat heavy on shoulders that suddenly felt too young, too unprepared. "Maintain spacing," he ordered over the tactical net. "Eyes high on those eastern ridges." The warning from Sergeant Reed had lodged in his mind like a splinter. Despite the official intelligence assessment, Porter had quietly repositioned his best marksmen to cover the eastern approaches and instructed vehicle commanders to prepare fallback positions. Small adjustments that wouldn't contradict the operational plan, but might save lives if the female sniper's concerns proved justified. 5 minutes to valley entrance," his driver announced, downshifting as the road narrowed. Porter keyed his radio again. "All units approaching phase line Alpha. Weapons tight. Stay alert." The Serpent Valley opened before them like the maw of some ancient beast. Steep walls rose on either side, their faces scarred with narrow goat paths and scattered vegetation. The valley floor, no more than 200 meters wide at its broadest point, offered minimal cover, a few scattered boulders, shallow depressions, and the dry stream bed that curved along its center. Beautiful country, Porter's gunner remarked, sweeping his weapon across the ridgelines. Shame about the neighborhood. Porter didn't respond, his attention fixed on the terrain. Everything about it whispered danger. The natural choke points, the commanding heights, the limited maneuver space. Sergeant Reed had been right. This was perfect ambush territory. Back at Firebase Liberty, the command center hummed with controlled tension. Multiple screens displayed drone feeds, GPS tracking of the convoy, and communications monitoring. Colonel Harrison stood at the central console, his face illuminated by the blue glow of tactical displays. Convoy approaching Phase Line Alpha, a communications officer reported. All elements report conditions normal. Harrison nodded, his expression neutral. Maintain surveillance focus on the northern exit point. That's where we expect any resistance. In the shadowed periphery of the room, Sergeant Sophie Reed monitored a secondary display. Unlike the officers focused on the convoy's position, her attention was fixed on the ridgelines above. Her trained eyes scanned for the telltale signs others might miss. Disturbed vegetation, shadow movements, the glint of metal where none should be. She spotted the first anomaly almost immediately, a thin wisp of what might have been cigarette smoke rising from a rocky outcropping 600 meters above the valley entrance. Then a second, the slight movement of a tarp-like material that didn't match the natural coloration of the surroundings. Then a third, a momentary flash of reflection from what could only be a scope or binoculars. "Sir," she said, turning to the colonel, "I'm detecting multiple signatures on the eastern ridge. Possible observation posts." Harrison didn't look away from the main display. "Noted, Sergeant. Sir, these match classic pre-ambush positioning. I recommend immediate warning to the convoy commander." Sergeant Murphy, manning the communications station, snorted. "Seeing ghosts, Reed. Drone shows clear." "Drones aren't looking for what I'm seeing," Sophie insisted, her voice level despite the urgency building in her chest. "There are at least 3 observation positions with line of sight to the convoy route." Harrison finally turned, his expression cold. "Sergeant, return to your assigned monitoring station. We have trained imagery analysts for threat assessment." "With respect, sir." "That's an order, Sergeant." Sophie fell silent, returning to her station with the rigid control of someone containing a volcano. Her eyes flicked between the screen and the colonel, measuring the distance to the radio console, calculating how quickly she could transmit a warning if necessary. In the valley, the convoy continued its advance, now fully committed to the narrow passage. Porter scanned the ridgelines, the prickling sensation on the back of his neck intensifying with each meter they progressed. The valley had fallen unnaturally silent. No birds, no insect sounds, nothing but the rumble of engines and the creak of equipment. "I don't like this," his gunner muttered. "Too quiet." Porter keyed his radio. "All units, increase interval to 50 meters. Something's off." As the vehicles began to spread out, providing less concentrated targets, Porter's eyes caught a subtle movement on the eastern ridge, a dark shape shifting against the rocks. He raised his binoculars for a closer look. In the split second before everything changed, he saw it clearly. The distinctive tube of an RPG launcher being raised to a shoulder. "Contact right." "RPG, take cov!" The world exploded. The lead vehicle disappeared in a blossoming fireball, its front end lifted 3 feet off the ground by the force of the blast. Almost simultaneously, a daisy chain of IEDs detonated along the valley floor, bracketing the convoy in fire and shrapnel. The carefully orchestrated thunder of explosions echoed off the valley walls, multiplying the sound into a physical force that hammered eardrums and disoriented even veteran Marines. Before the smoke cleared, automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions on both ridgelines. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the valley in glowing webs of death, finding targets with unerring precision. Marines scrambled for what little cover existed, returning fire at enemies they could barely see. Ambush! Ambush! The cry echoed across the tactical net, followed by the controlled chaos of unit commanders organizing defensive positions and casualty reports. Porter found himself pinned behind the smoking engine block of his destroyed Humvee, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. His driver lay motionless beside him, half his face missing. The gunner screamed somewhere behind him, high-pitched and inhuman, the sound of a man discovering parts of himself no longer attached. "This is Porter. We're pinned at grid 7904, taking heavy fire from both ridgelines. Multiple casualties." In the command center, all pretense of routine operations vanished. The screens displayed the unfolding catastrophe in high-definition clarity. Vehicles burning, Marines scattered and pinned down, muzzle flashes dotting the ridgelines like malevolent stars. F-15s are 20 minutes out, Major Ellis reported, his voice tight. Artillery support is being calculated, but we risk friendly fire with the current dispersion pattern. Colonel Harrison's face had gone gray. "Get me options, people. Now." Sophie stood frozen at her monitoring station, watching the slaughter unfold exactly as she had predicted. Her eyes mapped the enemy positions, identifying the primary firing points, calculating angles and distances with the automatic precision of a computer. In her mind, she was already on the ridge, rifle in hand, eliminating threats one by one. "Sir," she said, approaching the colonel, "I can provide precision fire support from the northern overlook. With a clear line of sight to the eastern ridge, I can suppress the heaviest concentration of enemy fire." Harrison didn't look at her. "Negative, Sergeant. The 200-meter proximity restriction is in effect. No personnel enter the engagement zone. Marines are dying, sir." "I'm aware, Sergeant." His voice was ice. "Return to your station." Murphy looked up from his console, his earlier swagger replaced by genuine fear as reports of casualties flooded in. "Echo 3 reports 6 KIA, 14 wounded. They can't reach the casualties under current fire." More reports cascaded in, each worse than the last. A machine gun position on the eastern ridge had pinned down an entire platoon. RPG teams were methodically destroying what remained of the vehicles. Snipers eliminated anyone who attempted to organize a coordinated response. On the main screen, the drone feed captured a Marine dragging a wounded comrade toward a shallow depression. 3 rounds kicked up dirt around them before the 4th found its mark, dropping both men in sprays of red mist. "This isn't a standard Taliban ambush," Commander Wilson observed, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The firing discipline, the positioning, the coordination. This is professional military training." Bill Carter, who had entered the command center silently during the commotion, moved to stand beside Wilson. "Russian doctrine," he said quietly. "I've seen it before." Sophie's head snapped toward them. The confirmation of what she already suspected sent ice through her veins. If a former Spetsnaz operator was coordinating this ambush, the Marines below had even less chance than she'd initially calculated. The radio crackled with Lieutenant Porter's voice, now ragged with pain and desperation. "Command, we are combat ineffective. I count at least 40 dead, unknown wounded. We need immediate air support or we're all gonna die here." Colonel Harrison turned to the communications officer. "Tell them to hold position. Air support is inbound." "In 20 minutes, Sophie said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "They'll be overrun in 5. Harrison spun to face her, his professional mask cracking. "Sergeant, if you cannot maintain proper discipline, you will be removed from this room." Sophie met his gaze without flinching. "I can end this," she repeated, her voice steady and certain. "Let me take the shot. The 200-meter rule exists for a reason, Sergeant. No exceptions." Another screen showed a Taliban fighter executing a wounded Marine at point-blank range. No one in the command center spoke. The only sound was the continuous stream of desperate radio calls from Marines watching their brothers die while help remained frustratingly out of reach. Sophie looked from Harrison to Bill, whose weathered face revealed nothing but whose eyes spoke volumes. Then to Commander Wilson, who studied her with the calculating gaze of a man measuring options against outcomes. She made her decision. Without another word, Sophie turned and walked toward the exit, her stride purposeful and unhurried. No one moved to stop her. Perhaps they didn't notice her departure amid the chaos. Perhaps they chose not to see. Outside the command center, she broke into a run. The armory was quiet when Sophie entered, the weapons chief having been called to the command center during the crisis. She moved with practiced efficiency, retrieving her M4A5 from its rack and collecting the additional equipment she would need. A suppressor, match-grade ammunition, a rangefinder, and her small green notebook containing ballistic calculations specific to the Serpent Valley. She worked methodically, checking each component with the focused intensity of someone performing a ritual. The scope mount was secured to exact specifications. The bipod legs were adjusted and locked. The suppressor was carefully threaded to prevent misalignment. Each 300 Winchester Magnum round was inspected for imperfections before being loaded into the magazine. As she prepared, a shadow fell across the doorway. She didn't need to look up to know who stood there. "You're about to disobey a direct order," Bill said, his voice neutral. "Yes, sir. Harrison will court-martial you for this. If I'm still alive afterward." "Yes, sir." Bill stepped into the armory, closing the door behind him. "You'll need a spotter." Sophie looked up, surprise crossing her features. "You're volunteering?" "Hell no," the old sniper snorted. "These knees haven't climbed a mountain in 15 years, but I can get you past the perimeter guards without questions." He moved to a storage locker and retrieved a handheld weather meter. Valley winds shift counterclockwise in the afternoons. Temperature gradient will create a mirage layer about 2 feet above the valley floor. Account for it. Sophie nodded, tucking the meter into her vest. "I know the shooter, or at least his training. Viktor Sokolov, former Spetsnaz, likely deployed as a private contractor." She secured the rifle case and stood. "He'll have established a command position with overlapping fields of fire. Take him out first, and the rest of the ambush falls apart." Bill's eyes narrowed. "You sound certain." "Because it's what I would do." Sophie checked her sidearm, a standard issue M9 Beretta. "And we were trained by the same people." Understanding dawned on the old sniper's face. "The Joint Training Program at Fort Benning, 2008. Sophie nodded. "Master Sergeant Volkov. Best instructor I ever had." Her expression hardened. "Now he's killing Marines for money." "You sure it's him?" "The ambush setup is his signature. Multiple interlocking fields of fire, prioritizing crew-serve weapons at the choke points. Counter-sniper positions pre-established." She secured her gear. "He taught us this exact scenario as the perfect ambush." Bill considered this, then moved to the window to check the perimeter. "Northern approach will be your best bet. There's a ridge that provides line of sight to both sides of the valley. Marines call it Devil's Ridge, not on any official maps." "I know it. Calculated firing solutions last night." A ghost of a smile crossed the old sniper's face. "Of course you did." He turned back to her. "What's your plan once you're in position?" "Priority targets first, machine gun nests, then RPG teams, then command elements." Sophie secured her helmet. "Create a corridor for evacuation." "And Sokolov?" Her eyes hardened. "If I see him, he dies first." Bill nodded, then reached into his pocket and removed a tarnished challenge coin, a Marine Corps sniper emblem worn smooth by years of handling. "Thomas gave me this after Fallujah. Said it brought him luck. He pressed it into her palm. Figure you could use some luck today. Sophie closed her fingers around the coin, a rare show of emotion crossing her features. Thank you. Don't thank me, Bill's voice roughened. Just come back alive. I'm too old to break in another student. Together, they moved through the base, Bill's presence providing the authorization needed to bypass security checkpoints. At the northern perimeter, he engaged the guards in conversation about an equipment inspection, creating the distraction Sophie needed to slip past the wire. Before she disappeared into the rocky terrain, Bill caught her arm. Sophie. His use of her first name, a break from military protocol, underscored the gravity of the moment. The shots that matter most are the ones nobody sees coming. Remember that. She nodded once, then vanished into the landscape, becoming just another shadow among many. The climb to Devil's Ridge was punishing. The terrain rose at a steep incline, loose shale shifting treacherously underfoot. The Afghan sun hammered down with brutal intensity, baking the rocks until they radiated heat like furnace bricks. Sophie moved steadily upward, controlling her breathing, conserving energy, her rifle case secured diagonally across her back. Each pause to rest became an opportunity to survey the battlefield below. The sounds of combat echoed up from the valley, the distinctive chatter of M4 carbines, the heavier thump of Taliban PKM machine guns, the hollow crump of RPG launches. Radio discipline had broken down, with fragmented transmissions cutting across each other in a cacophony of desperation. Pinned down at the southern, need immediate medevac, out of ammunition, requesting, oh God, they're flanking us from. Sophie blocked out the voices, focusing only on her objective. Emotional detachment was essential for what came next. Marines were dying below, but allowing that knowledge to affect her judgment would only result in more deaths. After 40 minutes of grueling ascent, she reached the ridge. The position was perfect, a natural depression in the rock that offered both cover and a commanding view of the valley. She set up methodically, arranging her equipment with practiced precision. First came the rifle, assembled and secured on its bipod. Then the rangefinder, set to her right for easy access. Her notebook, open to the relevant ballistic tables, was positioned under a small rock to prevent the wind from disturbing it. Finally, she arranged herself in a stable shooting position, her body forming a straight line behind the rifle to absorb recoil evenly. Through her scope, the valley transformed from chaotic battlefield to ordered geometry. She could see individual Marines pinned behind inadequate cover, the muzzle flashes of enemy positions, the systematic movement of Taliban fighters as they tightened the noose around the beleaguered convoy. She began her assessment, identifying and prioritizing targets with cold efficiency. The eastern ridge held 3 primary machine gun nests that commanded the valley floor. The western ridge contained the RPG teams that had destroyed the lead vehicles and were now targeting the few remaining operational Humvees. Between them, these positions had created a killing zone from which there was no escape. Lieutenant Porter had established a defensive position behind a cluster of destroyed vehicles, gathering the wounded in a depression that offered minimal protection. Even from this distance, Sophie could see he was injured, one arm hanging limp at his side as he directed his remaining Marines. Murphy, surprisingly, had taken command of a smaller group to the north, organizing a disciplined defense despite being wounded himself. Blood darkened the side of his uniform, but he continued to direct fire and attend to the wounded around him. Sophie's attention shifted to the enemy positions. As suspected, they displayed a level of tactical sophistication rarely seen among Taliban fighters. The machine guns were perfectly placed for interlocking fields of fire. The RPG teams repositioned after each shot to avoid counterfire. Snipers operated in coordinated pairs rather than as individuals. And then she saw him, a figure positioned on a rocky outcrop halfway up the eastern ridge. Unlike the black-clad Taliban fighters, this man wore desert camouflage and moved with the distinctive economy of a professional soldier. He carried no visible weapon but directed those around him with hand signals that Sophie recognized immediately. Viktor Sokolov, former Spetsnaz operator, current mercenary, the architect of the ambush, killing her fellow Marines. She adjusted her position, centering her crosshairs on his chest. Range, 1-200 meters. A challenging shot under ideal conditions, nearly impossible given the current variables. Shifting winds, heat mirage, the target's partial concealment behind rocks. For a moment, memory overlaid reality. Sokolov standing behind her at Fort Benning, correcting her shooting posture with firm hands, his accented voice explaining the mathematics of long-distance shooting. The grudging respect in his eyes when she outshot every other student in the class. The best shot, he had told her, is the one your enemy never expects. Sophie exhaled slowly, emptying her lungs completely. Her heartbeat slowed, each pulse distinct and measurable. The crosshair settled, wavered slightly with her heartbeat, then stabilized as she timed her shot between beats. Her finger took up the slack in the trigger, a smooth, continuous pressure rather than a pull. 1 pound of pressure, 2, 3. At the precise moment of perfect alignment, the rifle cracked, its report muffled by the suppressor, but still audible in the thin mountain air. The recoil flowed through her body like a wave, absorbed and channeled. Through the scope, she watched Sokolov jerk backward, a spray of red mist erupting from his chest. He collapsed behind the rocks, visible only as a set of boots protruding at an unnatural angle. Before the echo of the shot had faded, Sophie was already cycling the bolt, ejecting the spent casing and chambering another round. No time for confirmation or satisfaction. One target down, many more to follow. She shifted her aim to the nearest machine gun position where 2 Taliban fighters maintained a steady stream of fire into a group of pinned Marines. The range was shorter, approximately 900 meters, but the wind had shifted, requiring a quick recalculation. 2 shots, 2 bodies slumping over their weapon. Next came an RPG team preparing to fire on Porter's position. 1 shot for the gunner, another for his assistant. The rocket launcher clattered to the ground, unfired. Below in the valley, confusion spread through the Taliban ranks as their carefully coordinated ambush began to unravel. Fighters looked up, trying to identify the source of the unseen death striking their positions. Commands were shouted in Pashto, contradicting each other as uncertainty replaced confidence. In the command center at Firebase Liberty, the sudden shift in battlefield dynamics registered on multiple monitors. Enemy positions that had maintained continuous fire for 30 minutes suddenly fell silent. Taliban fighters who had been advancing confidently began to scatter, seeking cover from an invisible threat. "What the hell is happening?" Colonel Harrison demanded, watching the screens with growing confusion. "That, Colonel," Bill said, allowing himself a small, satisfied smile, "is what happens when you put the right Marine in the right position." Realization dawned on Harrison's face. "Reed," he breathed, anger and disbelief warring in his expression. "She disobeyed direct orders." "Yes, sir," Bill agreed calmly. "And she's currently saving the lives of 480 Marines who would otherwise be coming home in body bags." On the tactical radio, a new energy entered the transmissions from the valley. What had been desperate pleas for support transformed into organized response as the overwhelming enemy fire suddenly diminished. "This is Porter. Enemy machine gun nest on Eastern Ridge eliminated. Establishing casualty collection point at grid 8001. Another voice cut across the net. Murphy, strained but determined. "Something's taking out the tangos on the high ground. Unknown friendly sniper providing overwatch." Commander Wilson, who had been silently monitoring the situation, stepped forward. That firing pattern, his voice trailed off as he studied the drone feed showing enemy positions being systematically eliminated. I've seen it before. Where? Harrison demanded. Wilson's eyes met Bill's across the room. Fallujah, 5 years ago. He turned to the radio operator. Patch me through to the battalion net. Now. When handed the microphone, Wilson's voice took on a formal quality rarely heard outside of official ceremonies. All units, this is Commander Wilson. Be advised, Phantom 7 is on overwatch. Repeat, Phantom 7 has the high ground. A stunned silence fell across the radio net, followed by a cascade of responses. Did he say Phantom 7? That's just a rumor. Holy, is it really? I thought that was classified. Even Colonel Harrison seemed shaken. Phantom 7? That program was deactivated years ago. The program, yes, Wilson agreed. The operator still exists. On the ridge above the valley, Sophie continued her methodical work. Each shot was calculated, executed, and immediately followed by repositioning to avoid counter-sniper fire. She moved like a ghost along the ridgeline, appearing at one position long enough for a single shot, then vanishing before enemy spotters could fix her location. The rhythm of combat became a dance she knew intimately. Observe, calculate, breathe, squeeze, move. No wasted motion, no hesitation. The rifle an extension of her will, translating thought into kinetic force delivered with surgical precision across impossible distances. When a Taliban spotter finally located her position and directed fire in her direction, she was already gone, reappearing 50 meters away to eliminate him with a shot that defied the mathematics of probability. A 100-meter kill through gusting winds and heat mirage. Below, Porter had reorganized his surviving Marines into a defensive perimeter, now able to return effective fire as the overwhelming enemy superiority disappeared one precision shot at a time. Murphy led a team to recover wounded from exposed positions, the suppressing fire from above creating corridors of relative safety through the battlefield. Then came the radio call that changed everything. All units, this is actual. Black Hawks inbound. ETA 15 minutes. Mark LZs with smoke when ready. Evacuation was coming, but 15 minutes remained an eternity on a battlefield where life expectancy was measured in seconds. The surviving Marines would need continuous covering fire until the helicopters arrived. Sophie settled into her final position, a narrow crevice that offered both concealment and a commanding field of fire. From here, she could control the approaches to the designated landing zones, creating a protective umbrella beneath which the evacuation could proceed. As she scanned for targets, movement on the western ridge caught her attention. A Taliban fighter had positioned himself on a rocky outcrop with a clear line of sight to the primary landing zone. In his hands was not an AK-47, but the distinctive tube of a Dragunov SVD, the standard sniper rifle of Russian-trained forces. The counter-sniper had arrived. Sophie calculated the shot, 300 meters with a crosswind gusting to 15 knots, beyond the effective range of her rifle under these conditions, beyond what most would consider possible. Yet she had made such shots before. She adjusted her position, mentally recalculating the ballistics. The bullet would drop approximately 25 feet over that distance. The wind would push it nearly 6 feet to the left. The Earth's rotation would add a slight rightward drift at the extreme range. As she prepared to take the shot, a glint of light from a different position caught her attention. The reflection of sunlight on a scope lens. A second sniper, this one positioned to create a crossfire with the first. They were hunting her now, professionals recognizing a superior threat and coordinating to eliminate it. Sophie had seconds to decide, engage the first sniper and expose herself to the second, or reposition and risk losing them both in the process. The decision was made for her when a round cracked past her head, close enough that she felt the displacement of air against her cheek. The second sniper had spotted her. Moving with controlled urgency, she rolled sideways into a shallow depression, keeping her rifle tight against her body. Another round struck where she had been lying, sending rock fragments stinging across her exposed skin. For the first time since beginning her mission, Sophie found herself on the defensive, pinned by accurate fire from an opponent with similar training and equipment. The rules of engagement had shifted from hunter to hunted. She took a deep breath, forcing her heart rate to slow despite the surge of adrenaline. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Time was running out for the Marines below. The evacuation helicopters were inbound. She needed to regain control of the high ground. Removing her helmet, she placed it carefully on the end of her cleaning rod and slowly raised it above the rocky depression. A shot rang out immediately, punching through the Kevlar with precision that confirmed her suspicions. These were not ordinary Taliban fighters, but trained professionals. The muzzle flash provided what she needed, the exact position of the second sniper. In one fluid motion, she pivoted around the rock face, brought her rifle to bear, and fired. Through the scope, she saw the sniper jerk backward, then lie still. One down, one remaining. Repositioning again, she focused on the original sniper on the western ridge. He would have seen his partner fall and would be expecting her to engage. This would be a battle of patience. The first to move would likely be the one to die. Minutes stretched into an eternity as Sophie remained perfectly still, controlling her breathing to prevent the rise and fall of her chest from giving away her position. The sun beat down mercilessly, sweat running into her eyes and salt crystallizing on her skin as it dried. Still, she didn't move. In the valley below, the first evacuation helicopters appeared on the horizon, their distinctive silhouettes growing larger against the azure sky. Porter's Marines popped colored smoke to mark the landing zone, the green cloud billowing and swirling in the hot valley air. The moment had come. The enemy sniper would have to take his shot at the helicopters or lose his opportunity. Sophie tensed, her crosshairs fixed on the position where she knew he waited. When he finally moved, it was with the confidence of someone who believed his opponent neutralized. He rose slightly, adjusting his position to engage the approaching helicopters. In that moment of exposure, Sophie took her shot. At 1,300 meters with gusting winds and a partially obscured target, it was as much art as science, a shot that defied mathematical probability, relying instead on intuition honed through thousands of hours behind a rifle. The bullet traveled for nearly 2 full seconds, a lifetime in which a million variables could alter its path. Through her scope, Sophie saw the enemy sniper suddenly pitch sideways, his rifle tumbling from lifeless hands. Below, the first Black Hawk descended into the green smoke, its rotors whipping the marker into a frenzied spiral. Marines moved toward it in disciplined groups, carrying their wounded, covering each other's approach with disciplined fire. Lieutenant Porter directed the evacuation from a kneeling position, one arm hanging useless at his side, but his voice still strong over the tactical net. First chalk away, wounded only. Second bird, stand by. Sophie continued her overwatch, eliminating any threat that emerged to challenge the evacuation. Her ammunition had dwindled to a handful of rounds, each one now reserved for only the most critical targets. The rifle barrel had heated from repeated firing, creating additional variables she compensated for instinctively. As the third helicopter lifted away with its precious cargo of wounded Marines, Sophie spotted movement in her peripheral vision. A group of Taliban fighters working their way up the ridge toward her position. They had finally identified the source of their troubles and committed a squad to eliminate her. She counted 8 fighters moving with the cautious precision of experienced combatants. Her remaining ammunition, 5 rounds. The math was simple and unforgiving. Gathering her essential equipment, Sophie began a tactical withdrawal, moving laterally along the ridge to find a more defensible position. Below, the evacuation continued, with nearly half the surviving Marines now safely aboard the helicopters. A few more minutes, and the operation would be complete. She just needed to survive those minutes. Finding a narrow cleft between two boulders, she set up her final position. From here, she could cover both the approaching enemy fighters and maintain overwatch on the landing zone. The Taliban squad had split into two groups, attempting to flank her position from both sides. Sophie took aim at the closest fighter, squeezing the trigger with the same controlled precision that had characterized every shot that day. The man fell without a sound. His companions immediately took cover, now aware of her new position. 4 rounds remaining, 7 fighters. In the command center, the evacuation's progress was tracked with clinical precision. Screens displayed the systematic extraction of Marines from what had begun as a death trap and was now transforming into one of the most successful emergency evacuations in recent memory. 3 chalks complete, the operations officer reported. Approximately 60% of personnel extracted. Colonel Harrison stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. The initial shock of Sophie's disobedience had transformed into something more complex, a reluctant acknowledgement that her actions, while contrary to direct orders, had saved hundreds of lives. "And Sergeant Reed?" he asked quietly. Bill, who had been monitoring a separate radio frequency, looked up. "Still providing overwatch, but she's got company. Taliban squad closing on her position. Can we extract her?" "Not without compromising the main evacuation. She's too far up the ridge for a standard pickup." Bill's weathered face betrayed no emotion, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the console. She knew the odds when she went up there. Commander Wilson, who had been coordinating with the helicopter pilots, turned toward them. "I'm not leaving her up there." His voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to having his orders obeyed. "Not again." Harrison's brow furrowed. "Again?" "Fallujah," Wilson said simply. "We left her behind once before when she saved my team. Classified her actions out of existence because a female sniper making the longest confirmed kill in theater was politically inconvenient." His eyes hardened. "I swore I'd never make that mistake again." Before Harrison could respond, Wilson was already moving toward the door. "I need a fast rope team and a little bird, now." On the ridge, Sophie had expended all but her final round. The Taliban fighters had worked their way closer now, confident in their numerical superiority. She could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their final assault on her position. Below, the last evacuation helicopter lifted away from the valley floor. Heavy with wounded Marines but flying free from the killing zone that had nearly claimed them all. Mission accomplished. 480 Marines, or what remained of them, were safe. Now it was just Sophie, 1 bullet, and 7 determined enemies between her and any hope of extraction. She checked her sidearm. The standard issue M9 held a full magazine of 15 rounds plus 1 in the chamber. Not ideal for the ranging engagement she expected, but better than facing enemy fighters with only a knife. As she prepared for her final stand, a new sound cut through the mountain air, the distinctive chop of rotor blades, but lighter and faster than the Blackhawks that had conducted the main evacuation. A little bird. The nimble helicopter favored by special operations forces for insertions into difficult terrain. The Taliban fighters heard it too. Their advance temporarily halted as they sought the source of the sound. It appeared suddenly from behind the ridgeline, hugging the terrain with the aggressive posture of an aircraft being flown at the edge of its performance envelope. Sophie recognized the maneuver immediately, a hot extraction under fire. The little bird hovered 30 feet above the ridgeline, 2 ropes dropping from its doors as 2 figures fast roped to the ground. Even at this distance, Sophie recognized Commander Wilson's distinctive profile. The SEAL commander had come himself, bringing a single operator with him. The Taliban fighters, momentarily confused by this new development, refocused their attention on this new threat. They opened fire on the SEALs, who immediately sought cover among the rocks. Sophie saw her opportunity. With the enemy's attention divided, she emerged from her position, her rifle abandoned in favor of her sidearm's mobility. Moving in a low crouch, she approached the nearest Taliban fighter from behind. The M9 barked 3 times in rapid succession. The fighter dropped without knowing what had hit him. His companions turned in confusion, caught between the SEALs in front and an unexpected threat from behind. Wilson and his operator used the distraction to advance, their suppressed HK-416s making little sound, but delivering devastating effect. 2 more Taliban fighters fell under their precise fire, 4 down, 3 to go. Sophie moved again, circling to approach from a different angle. The remaining Taliban fighters, now realizing they were caught in a pincer movement, began a desperate retreat down the ridge. Her sidearm cracked again, dropping another fighter. The final 2 disappeared behind an outcropping, their will to fight apparently broken by the sudden reversal of fortune. Wilson approached, his weapon still at the ready, but his eyes bright with something like triumph. "Sergeant Reed," he said formally, "thought you might need a ride." "Wasn't expecting one, sir." "Yeah, well." The SEAL commander glanced toward the valley, where smoke still rose from burning vehicles. "I owed you one from Fallujah." The little bird descended again, hovering just above the ridge with its skids nearly touching the rocks. No time for conversation or explanation. Wilson motioned toward the helicopter. "Time to go, Phantom 7. Your work here is done." 3 days later, Sophie stood at attention in Colonel Harrison's office. The intervening time had passed in a blur of medical examinations, debriefings, and the uneasy sleep of someone who has walked too close to the edge. Her arm, bandaged where shrapnel had torn through the flesh, throbbed dully beneath her uniform. Harrison sat behind his desk, reviewing a file with the studied concentration of a man deliberately postponing an unpleasant task. Finally, he closed the folder and looked up at her. 412, he said. Sophie remained silent, uncertain where this was heading. 412 Marines returned from Serpent Valley, Harrison continued. The remaining 68 didn't make it. He leaned back in his chair. Those numbers should have been reversed. We were walking into a slaughter. Yes, sir. You disobeyed a direct order, Sergeant Reed. Left your post without authorization. Engaged enemy forces outside command structure. His voice was flat, reciting facts rather than accusations. Yes, sir. Harrison studied her face. Under normal circumstances, those actions would result in court-martial proceedings. I understand, sir. However, Harrison picked up another folder, this one bearing classification markings. It seems there was a communication error. According to this, your presence on Devil's Ridge was part of a classified joint operation authorized at levels above my pay grade. His tone made it clear what he thought of this convenient fiction. A special directive that I was never made aware of, he continued, despite being the commanding officer of both the base and the operation. Sir, Harrison raised a hand, cutting her off. Spare me, Sergeant. We both know what really happened. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the mountains that had claimed so many lives. The bureaucracy has its ways of rewriting history when it suits certain agendas. He turned back to face her. What I want to know is why. Not why you disobeyed orders. That's obvious enough. But why you're the one they buried in support duties when you clearly possess exceptional capabilities. Sophie hesitated, uncertain how much Harrison already knew. How much had been revealed in the aftermath. Permission to speak freely, sir? Harrison nodded. 5 years ago, I recorded what was then the longest confirmed kill by any American sniper in Iraq, one of 430 meters. That shot saved 30 Delta Force operators, including Commander Wilson. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The mission was classified, but word got out. Some elements in command structure were uncomfortable with the narrative of a female sniper achieving what many male counterparts couldn't. So they buried you. It wasn't a question. They modified my record and reassigned me to support duties, sir. Less conspicuous. Harrison returned to his desk, his expression thoughtful. And now? Now, sir. What happens to you now, Sergeant Reed? I've received transfer orders. Special Operations Command is requesting your immediate reassignment for what they're calling Advanced Tactical Deployment Training. Sophie kept her expression neutral. I wasn't aware, sir. Of course not. Harrison's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile under different circumstances. Just like I wasn't aware of your authorized presence on Devil's Ridge. He signed the transfer papers with a deliberate flourish. Effective immediately. Your record here will show an honorable reassignment with commendation for actions during Operation Valley Sweep. He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Don't thank me, Sergeant. I had no choice in the matter. His voice softened slightly. But off the record, what you did required exceptional courage, both physical and moral. Those Marines who returned from that valley owe you their lives. Sophie came to attention and saluted crisply. Thank you, sir. Harrison returned the salute. Dismissed, Sergeant. Your transport leaves at 1600. Outside the colonel's office, Sophie found Murphy waiting, his arm in a sling where a bullet had caught him during the evacuation. The antagonism that had characterized their previous interactions was gone, replaced by something more complicated. Reed, he acknowledged her with a nod. Murphy. She returned the gesture, prepared to walk past him. Wait. He seemed to struggle with something. I heard what happened up there. What you did. Sophie said nothing, watching him work through whatever he needed to say. I called you a quota filler. His voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. Said you could barely carry a rifle. Then you saved my life from that ridge. He looked away, then back at her, his eyes direct. I was wrong. About you. About a lot of things. We're Marines, Sophie said simply. We do what's necessary when it's necessary. Yeah, well, Murphy extended his good hand. Thank you, Sergeant Reed, for what it's worth. She accepted the handshake, recognizing it as more significant than the simple words that accompanied it. In that moment, she wasn't a female Marine or a quota sniper or an outsider in a male-dominated world. She was simply a Marine who had done her duty when it mattered most, recognized as such by a fellow warrior who had finally seen past his own prejudices. Later, as she packed her few belongings, Commander Wilson appeared at her door. Ready for your next chapter? Do I have a choice, sir? There's always a choice, Reed. Wilson leaned against the doorframe. The question is whether you're willing to live with the consequences. Sophie considered this. What exactly is this advanced tactical deployment training? Nothing so mundane. Wilson handed her a folder, unmarked, its contents visible only when he opened it to reveal surveillance photos of known terrorist leaders alongside maps of regions far from Afghanistan. Global Special Activities Division, black budget, compartmentalized command structure, zero public footprint. Phantom by another name, Sophie observed. More adaptable, less oversight. Wilson studied her reaction. You've demonstrated exceptional capabilities under extreme pressure. More importantly, you've shown the judgment and moral clarity necessary for independent operations. I have conditions, she said finally. Wilson raised an eyebrow. Such as? I remain a Marine, not just an asset. I operate with autonomy, but within a framework of accountability. She paused. And I want Bill as my handler. Someone who will tell me when I'm crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. Those aren't standard protocols for the division. Neither am I, Sophie replied simply. A slow smile spread across Wilson's face. No, you certainly are not. He extended his hand. Welcome to the shadows, Phantom 7, on your terms. As they shook hands, Sophie felt the weight of her father's metal disc in her pocket. She had started this journey as an afterthought, a token female in a male-dominated world. Now she stood as something else entirely, a Marine who had proven her worth not through words, but through decisive action when it mattered most. That evening, she found Bill at the range, methodically cleaning a vintage rifle with the same care she'd shown her M485. "Heard you requested me as your handler," he said without looking up. "Brave choice. I'm not known for being gentle." "I don't need gentle," Sophie replied. "I need honest." Bill nodded, setting aside his cleaning cloth. "Your father used to say something about snipers. We don't seek glory, we seek impact. The shot nobody sees coming, but everyone feels." Sophie smiled, feeling a sense of completion she hadn't experienced since her father's death. "Sounds like him." "Sounds like you," Bill corrected, looking up to meet her eyes. "Welcome home, Phantom.